שלא יוצא בעברית. אני מתנצל על כך, זה לא עניין עקרוני. פשוט רציתי לשמור עד כמה שאפשר על דיוק ההבאה. ברצוני גם להודות לפרופסור ארליך ומר בנימין, איפה שהוא, על ההזמנה ועל הטיפול היאה והנאה לכולנו. לפני כ5 שנים הזמינו אותי פרופסור אביגדור שנען להשתתף ביום עיון בירושלים למדות 30 שנה למותו של פרופסור יוסף היימן, שהוא היה המורה לשנינו. ולאמיתו של דבר, את המחקר הזה התחלתי אז מסיבות לוגיסטיות, לא יצא לי להשתתף ביום עיון, והייתי צריך להשאיר לצד את המחקר הזה. ואני שמח מאוד שאורי נתן לי הזדמנות לגמור אותו, כך שהנושא שלי גם משתלב עם ההרצאה של אביגדור מאתמול. עכשיו אעבור לאנגלית. It is a well-established fact that the Byzantine synagogue Haytanim were familiar with and made extensive use of Midrashic and Aggadic traditions that also appear in the Midrashic literature from the same and earlier periods. Although it is less clear and less likely that these traditions were known to them primarily from the written Midrash collections that have come down to us, rather than from a living oral tradition of study and use. And many of the people in this room have made that point in their publications many times. When we turn to the Petiḥta, that poetic structure initiated as far as we know by Yanai, and continued by followers such as Shimon bar Megas and Yehuda, this structure that elaborates the first 3 benedictions of Shabbat Amidah, it is well known that the first 3 poems cite respectively the first verse of the weekly Torah reading, the second verse of the weekly Torah reading, and the first verse of that week's Haftarah, before eventually transitioning to the liturgical Hatimah of each bracha, or in the case of the 3rd poem, to the liturgical phrase Ve'ata Kadosh El Na. These conclude each poem. Immediately following the citation of each of these verses, and preceding the poetic transition to the Hatimah, is a series of what has come to be known in English as intertexts. Zot omeret, poetic verses, mostly from the Ketuvim and the literary prophets, that have been used in the course of the poem to interpret the Torah or Haftarah verse in question. It is the deployment of those intertexts that I wish to explore in this paper. In particular, I am interested in their relationship to the intertexts that appear as Petiḥta verses in the Byzantine Midrash collections, and what this relationship might tell us both about the Zitzin Leben of the Petiḥta form, about which Abigail spoke last night, and about the more profound relationship between Midrash and Piyyut. Let me first back up and articulate part of the question from the perspective of Midrash scholarship. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, our teacher Yosef Heinemann wrote a series of articles on the nature of the Petiḥta as a homiletical form, and Avigdor mentioned these last night. His thesis was that the Petiḥta was not a proem, the opening to a sermon, but itself a freestanding sermon that began with the Petiḥta verse and created tension and expectation in the listener by weaving hither and yon before finally arriving at its goal, the connection with the week's Sederverse. Viewed this way, the Petiḥta was to be understood as a homiletical rhetorical form par excellence. Heinemann surmised that this kind of sermon might have been delivered before the Torah reading and led directly into it. This would account for its inverted form, moving from the Petiḥta verse to the Seder verse. He acknowledged that once the rhetorical form had become stereotypical, the editors of various Midrash collections may very well have composed additional literary Petiḥtot that, quote, were never delivered as actual sermons before an audience, unquote. He also acknowledged that some sermons, quote, would appear not to have been addressed to the public at large, but to the disciples of the preacher, unquote. That is to say, they would have functioned within the rabbinic circles of the Beit Midrash, rather than the wider population of the Beit HaKnesset. Expanding upon some of the literary observations of Hanoch Albeck in his introduction to the Theodor Albeck edition of Bereshit Rabbah, I suggested in a 1982 article that a large number of the Petiḥtot in Midrash Vayikra Rabbah indeed are editorial constructions that have been retrofitted to their redactional contexts. I nonetheless agreed that the Petiḥta as a rhetorical form points originally to an oral interpretive context, but remained skeptical as to whether that context was one of public sermons in the synagogue or rabbinic exegetical activity, including homilies, in the Beit Midrash. It turns out that the Yanayim Kedushtot may shed some light on this question. In this regard, it is first important to note that beyond the Petiḥta's unique rhetorical form, its conceptual essence and rationale are the intertextual connection that it draws between two scriptural verses. Its insistence that the two verses go together, that the usually non-Torah verse interprets or ramifies the Torah verse, while the Torah verse instantiates, matkim, the other verse. At the end of this paper, I'll discuss the significance of this fact at greater length. For the moment, we simply note that this is the Petiḥta's point of connection with the Piyyutim. Editors and annotators of the Kedushtot of Yanai, Shimon Bar Megas, and Yehuda, among others, often identify some of the intertexts cited in the Magen poem, that is the first poem in each series, as verses that also serve as Petiḥta verses in the classical Midrash collections. Since the synagogal Sitz im Leben of the Kedushtot is beyond question, the sustained use in these poems of Petiḥta verses that are associated with and interpret the same Torah Seder verses is clear proof that these hermeneutical associations, and perhaps the homiletical ones as well, were known in the synagogue. To be sure, the synagogue audience for the Yanayim Kedushtot would have been heterogeneous. Some listeners, no doubt, would simply have been entertained by the verbal fireworks of alliteration, wordplay, and increasing rhythmic speed, while others would have been able to follow the learned allusions of the synagogue poets to rabbinic midrashic and agadic traditions. But it is inconceivable that synagogue poets would have written poems for public audition that were totally unintelligible to their audiences. We must therefore conclude that these midrashic traditions, and specifically these midrashic associations of verses, were known to at least some portion of the audience in the synagogue before hearing them in the Piyyutim. The more detailed question that I want to turn to now is one of extent. The relationship between the intertexts of the Kedushtot and the Petiḥta verses previously has been remarked upon in the literature, but only in passing and somewhat impressionistically, mostly in the context of the annotations to the poems themselves. I was curious to see what a comprehensive collection of the data would actually show. And that is what you have in the handouts before you. working with the published critical editions of the Kedushtot of Yanai, Shimon bar Megas, and Yehuda, I have listed all of the intertexts that appear in the various Magen poems and connect with the first verse of the Seder Kri'ah, since this is the verse that appears at the end of the Petiḥta. The surviving manuscripts do not preserve Magen poems for every Seder, so the survey is limited, of course, by what we have. I've also looked at the intertexts in the Nachaye and Atakadosh poems for these Sidarim, although only the relevant instances appear in the notes to the spreadsheet. I specifically examined all of the poems for Bereshit and Vayikra, since we have 2 generations of Byzantine Midrash collections for each of these biblical books, Bereshit Rabbah and Vayikra Rabbah Lekakisa, and the Tanhuma Midrashim Le'idach Gisa. Among the latter, I also included the fragmentary text published by Yaakov Mann and Isaiah Zona in the Bible as read and preached in the ancient synagogue as Midrash Chadash al HaTorah. Numbers have been noted separately for each item with reference to each biblical book and then aggregated. Both the individual details and the larger picture are, I believe, significant. I may possibly, in the published version of this piece, look also at the materials for Shemot, the Midbar, and the Devarim. The issues there are slightly different because we only have Tanhuma-type Midrashim for these texts. The collected data, and to cut to the chase, the aggregates are at the very end, on page 11. The collected data indicate that slightly more than 1/3 of Yanai's intertexts in the Magen poems also appear as Petiḥta verses in the Midrash collections. There is no significant variance in this regard between the poems for Bereshit and for Vayikra. There are an additional 12 Petiḥta verses that are cited in Yanai's Mechaye poems, and 1 in an Atakadosh poem. This raises the percentage slightly. In the Magen poems of Shimon bar Megas, of which only 7 have been preserved for both Bereshit and Vayikra, fully half of the cited intertexts are Petiḥta verses. Again, there's no significant variation in percentage between Bereshit and Vayikra, although only 1 Magen poem for Vayikra has survived. The inclusion of 3 additional Petiḥta verses found in Shimon's Mechaye poems and 1 in his Atakadosh poem also makes no statistical significance. Yehuda, only 6 of whose Magen poems have been preserved, shows the smallest percentage of overlap with the Petiḥta verses, only about 12%. There are no overlaps at all in his Magen poems for Vayikra, of which only 2 have been preserved. As regards the Midrash collections, the percentage of Petiḥta verses in both Bereshit Rabbah and Vayikra Rabbah that appear as intertexts in the Magen poems of any of the 3 Payatanim is about 37%, which is a bit higher than the numbers for Yanai. There is no appreciable difference in this regard between the 2 Midrashic collections. The percentage is about the same for the Buber-Oxford manuscript of Midrash Tanhuma, and a bit less, interestingly enough, 29% for the printed edition of Midrash Tanhuma, where the numbers are considerably smaller for Vayikra, 10%, than for Bereshit, 34%. The percentage for Mann's Midrash Chadash al HaTorah, 34%, is slightly less than for the Buber Tanhuma and the 2 Rabbot. Also, the numbers for Vayikra, 30%, are just slightly lower than those for Bereshit, 35%. There are also a few details that we should note before again considering the larger picture and its possible implications. For one, the Payatonic intertexts sometimes can be applied to multiple verses in the same manner as the Petiḥta verses. A clear example of this is in Yanai's Magen poem to Bereshit 15:1, Achar ha'devarim ha'eleh haya devar Adonai el Avram b'machaseh, which deals with God's promise of abundant progeny to Abraham in a vision, Machazeh. one of the intertexts is Psalm 89:20. Az dibarta b'chazon l'chasidecha v'tomer shiviti eza al gibor ha'rimoti ba'u me'am. The connection with Genesis 15:1, of course, is in the first phrase. The divine speech b'machazeh b'chazon to chasidecha, of whom Avraham here is represented as the prime example. Psalm 89:20 appears as a particular verse not in Bereshit Rabbah or in Midrash Tanhuma to our verse, but in Vayikra Rabbah 1:4 to Vayikra 1:1, where the verse is applied midaber to a succession of three biblical characters: Abraham, David, Moshe. The connection to Abraham indeed is voiced there through Bereshit 15:1. But the tripartite complex Petiḥta also connects the Psalm verse to David through 2 Samuel 7:17, and Psalm 85:1-2, and to Moshe through Numbers 12:8 and Devarim 33:8. And then a secondary tradition at the end of the passage connects this to the second verse, which is Leviticus 1:1, where God calls out specifically to Moses. The point here is that the particular verse, which is applicable to all three biblical characters, can and does serve as an intertext for multiple Torah verses. The Piyyutanim are aware of this and carry forward this flexible usage in their own work. In a similar vein, while Yana uses Proverbs 19:17, Psalm 41:2, and in his Mechaye poem Proverbs 22:2, as intertexts to a seder beginning with Vayikra 25:35, V'chi yamuchachicha u'matei yado imach v'chazakta bo ger v'toshav v'chai imach. Vayikra Rabbah and the two recensions of Midrash Tanhuma do not know such a seder, but use all three of these as Petiḥta verses for a seder that begins instead with Leviticus 25:25. Ki yamuch achicha u'machar mi'akuzato u'va ga'olo ha'karev alav v'ga'al et minkachi. Surely the similarity between the opening words of these verses, as well as the similarity of their subject matter, easily accounts for such a transfer. And this may be additional proof for what Avigdor was talking about last night, that there are multiple sedarim that we simply may have indeed two liturgical customs that are reflected in these two types of texts. The point again is the flexibility in the use of and multiple applications for the particular verses intertexts. There are numerous instances of Piyyutonic intertextual linkages that also appear in the Midrashic literature, but not in the form of Petiḥta to say the verses. There are instances where the intertext verses referred in the Midrashic literature to the relevant biblical narrative situation or character without citing the specific verse at hand. For the purposes of this paper, I have not systematically listed or tabulated all those instances that are relevant here, although I did follow up on most of the references that Rabbi Novitz lists in his annotations to the Magen Mechayeh and Atakadosh poems of Yanaya, Bereshit, and Vayikra. Only 6 instances which are relevant to the Magen poems appear in the chart. We must also take note of the sizable number of intertexts in the poems examined that do not correspond to any particular verses in the Midrashic literature, and vice versa, the number of particular texts in the Midrashic literature that are not used as intertexts in these poems by the Piyyutanim. What seems noteworthy here is the degree of original creativity on display here, working, of course, within the traditional Midrashic mode of intertextual association. While we certainly don't have access to all of the Midrashic traditions from late antiquity in the Byzantine era, so that we can't say for sure that something not found elsewhere is therefore the original product of its author or editor, we can see in the Piyyutim creative workings of known exegetical traditions, and more than that, we can see in them creative and very likely original extensions of the Midrashic process of intertextual association, just as we find in the later Byzantine Tanhuma Midrashim particular verses that do not appear in the earlier Byzantine Midrashim, Bereshit Rabbah and Vayikra Rabbah. That means, as scholars of Piyyut, many in this room have argued previously, that we should indeed view the Piyyutanim as creative midrashists in their own right. We now return to our original question about the Sitzungsleben of the Petichtot and their relationship to the intertextual play in the first three poems of the synagogue Kedushtot. If we allow that the Petichta as a rhetorical form originated in the context of a public discourse or drasha, then both the Petichta and the intertextual Piyyut must be viewed as kinds of live oral public performances. The point of contact between them is that what is being performed or dramatized in both genres is the elaborated intertextual relationship among verses of Scripture. In the case of the Petichta, this performance is temporarily drawn out, often by referencing multiple additional, quote-unquote, less relevant intertextual connections along the way, so as to intentionally delay the arrival of the primary contextually relevant intertextual connection. In the case of the Piyyut, the performance is artistically enhanced and elaborated through the linguistic and poetic virtuosity of the poet that keeps in play multiple intertextual connections throughout the poem and concludes with yet another intertextual connection, that is, to the Chatima of the relevant benediction of the Amidah. Absent this performative rhetorical dimension, the essence of the Petichta is simply the assertion of an intertextual connection between two scriptural verses. Indeed, as is well known, some of the Tanchumei Yilamdenu materials preserved in the Geniza give us only this bare bones connection as the Petichta. There's some examples of this in the Man Midrash Chadash Torah, without any of the rhetorical or explanatory elaborations, indeed without even reciting the Seder verse after the particular verse. In fact, it's only the familiarity in the synagogue context with this most basic skeletal form of the Petichta that is certainly attested in the Kedushtot, since the performative rhetoric of the poems is quite different from that of the Petichtot. Circumstantially, however, we may conclude that such familiarity could only have been conveyed through some form of public performance, of which something resembling the literary Petichtot found in the classical Midrashic collections would be the most plausible, and here I am approaching a Bigor's position more and more. At the end of this paper, we should briefly consider the larger significance of the phenomenon we have been examining here, which must be located in its broader context, that of Midrashic hermeneutics. Rabbinic Midrashic hermeneutics from late antiquity down to the late Byzantine period is profoundly intertextual. That is, Scripture is constantly being read through Scripture. We may well ask why this is the case. Clearly, as scholarship has shown, a major part of the answer has to do with the multiple parallel and often conflicting traditions contained within the inherited scriptural library and the need to harmonize them, to make them speak with one normative voice. So Torah verses are juxtaposed and harmonized primarily with other Torah verses in the context of Midrash Halacha. In Midrash Agadah, Torah verses are frequently juxtaposed with poetic verses from Ketuvim or from the literary prophets. But from a more theological point of view, the terms probably should be reversed. It is rather the abstract, heterogeneous, sometimes arcane, sometimes potentially heterodox poetic verses of the writings and the prophetic literature that need to be domesticated through being firmly anchored to the normative Israelite narrative that is found in the books of the Torah. Recall in this regard the treatment of those most problematic books of Shir HaShirim, Kohelet, Iyov, and even Mishlei. Recall as well that the prophetic oracles could be, and were, construed variously by different religious groups to support very different religious expectations. This seems to be at least one of the reasons for the ubiquity in the Aggadic Midrashic literature of this kind of intertextual interpretation. This reason, please note, is fundamentally hermeneutical rather than homiletical. Viewed from this perspective, the Petichta as a rhetorical and even as a homiletical form should be construed as a particular subset or instantiation of the more ubiquitous rabbinic hermeneutical concern to ground the Ketuvim and the Nevi'im in the Torah narrative. The very same concern, of course, is displayed as well in the pietonic use of intertexts, explicitly in the first three poems of the Petiḥta, implicitly throughout the entire poetic series. While not denying the presence of aesthetic and rhetorical performative motivations here, it is important to remark that in the cases of both Petiḥta and Piyyut, the artistic and rhetorical forms are also manifestations of a more fundamental hermeneutical concern.